The following is an EWTN special presentation.
Well, it is now a great honor to introduce to you someone who is truly intergalactically smart, namely Bishop Robert Barron, who is no stranger to the Napa Institute. Bishop Barron, I think everyone knows, is the auxiliary bishop for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles for the region of Santa Barbara. And of course, prior to that, Bishop Barron, instituted, formed, and directed a Word on Fire, a global media ministry, in which he has written, honestly, hundreds of articles, produced hundreds of videos, done hundreds of letters and responses to questions. I mean, it's just an enormously valuable ministry for evangelization of Catholicism, especially among young people. He is noted, of course, for his PBS series, Catholicism, which a lot of non-Catholics have seen. Evangelization continues through his aegis. Prior to starting Word on Fire, he did his master's degree, as Andrew Bell just mentioned, at Catholic University of America. He did his PhD at the Institut Catholique de Paris. He also then went on to become professor of theology at Kenrick Seminary, and then visiting at Mundelein Seminary, and then visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame and the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. He also then went on to become the rector of Mundelein Seminary, boy, an unenviable task if ever there was one, and still continued to do Word on Fire while he was there until he was appointed in 2015 to be the auxiliary bishop of Los Angeles. A truly accomplished, truly brilliant, truly evangelical spirit. We welcome to the stage Bishop Robert Barron.
Well, thank you, Father Spitzer, and thanks everyone for being here. You know, that line he stole from me, intergalactically smart, but I applied it to him. I wrote an article about Father Spitzer, and I said, this guy is some kind of alien. I don't know have you been plowing through his books? You've been lecturing on these books. There you are. They're terrific, I think. I found them, not that many months ago, and I plowed through, I think it was volume 2 first, which I loved and wrote about, and I'm working through volume 3 right now. They're terrific, I think, because it's a very high level of evangelization and apologetics. So read Father Spitzer as much as you can. Also, congratulations to Tim Bush for pulling off this wonderful conference. I was here, I think it was 3 years ago, and I think it was half the size when I was here. So to see so many people, and it's just good for us, isn't it? Because we've all been hearing correctly, I mean, what a dark time we're going through in the culture. And so for us Catholics to get together and to share ideas and inspiration and just to be in each other's presence is great. It's a good thing. So, Tim, thank you for getting this thing off the ground. Here's my travel itinerary. I don't want that. I want my notes, don't I, for the talk. Hey, listen, I got limited time. 33 minutes and counting right there, I see.
Keep going.
No, it's okay. I know you've had a long morning. What I want to talk about, everybody, is King David. It might strike you as a little bit odd. Why is this man coming to Napa to talk about King David? Well, the practical reason is about 5 years ago, I was invited to write in this wonderful commentary series that Brazos Press puts out. They have theologians commenting on the biblical books. So Yaroslav Pelikan himself did the first one on the Acts of the Apostles, and everyone from Stanley Hauerwas to David Burrell to Matthew Levering, many others have written. So I was very honored to be asked to write on 2 Samuel, which wonderful text dealing with King David. And I must say, I've written about 15 books. I've never enjoyed researching a book more than this one. To be immersed in these great texts around King David and to search out the theological and spiritual meaning of this really pivotal text in the Bible. So I want to just share with you in this brief time I have just some of these insights. There's so much you could get. That's an ad for my book, by the way. That was subtly inserted there. Just a word about 1 and 2 Samuel. I think, and I very much have the Iliad and Odyssey in mind when I say this, I think it's simply one of the greatest texts to come down to us from the ancient world. Not just for its theology, which is enormously important, but simply as a literary text, as a text that explores human psychology, for the vividness of its characters, for its narrative verve. I can't think really of a better text from the ancient world than 1 and 2 Samuel. That distinction, by the way, is somewhat artificial. It's a function of the length of scrolls. When the book was translated into Greek, so much fit on one scroll, that becomes, 1 Samuel in our system, and then 2 Samuel. So there's no great difference in terms of authorship and theological theme and so on and so forth. Who wrote it? Well, the short answer is we just don't know. When was it written? Well, many people speculate a lot of the biblical books are written around that post-exilic period when Israel had had a pretty long theological development and also a somewhat serene time when this kind of literary work could be done. I find persuasive the view that there's this single, what they call Deuteronomistic history, going roughly from the book of Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, that one author, at least one editor, supervised the writing of that whole literature because there's a commonality of language, theological theme, etc. So I think 1 and 2 Samuel probably fit within that great Deuteronomistic history. Now, themes of importance abound in this text, and here's one I just want to put right up front, and I'll look at it from different angles. The theme of kingship. David is the great king in the tradition. He's the great king of Israel, the paradigmatic king. The fact that Jesus, the King of Kings, is the new David, the son of David, is extremely important. But look at, David is a pivotal figure, right in the middle of the biblical revelation, you might say, who pivots back toward Adam, who was the primal king, and pivots forward toward Christ, who's the King of Kings. I want to say a word about that link to Adam, which I think is very important. Go back to the opening verses of the Bible and this great story of creation. Here's the first thing to notice about it. In almost all the creation myths of the ancient world, all the creation stories, you find something like this: order coming about through a primal act of violence. One God conquering another, one group of gods overwhelming another, often making the universe from the body parts of the conquered gods and so on. What's first of all striking about Genesis, I think, is that creation happens in a nonviolent way. Order comes not through violence, but through an act of speech. Let there be light, and there was light. Let the world come forth, and it came forth, etc. God's nonviolent act of speech gives rise to the order of the world. But then, everybody, watch this. As everything comes forth from God, so the planets and the stars and the earth itself and the animals and the mountains and the rivers and so on, what are you seeing? You're seeing things that in various places and times in the ancient world were worshipped as divinities. People worship the moon and the sun and the stars. They worship the earth. They worship the mountains. What is the author of Genesis saying over and over again? These are not God. Good, indeed very good, but not God. I remember I had just gotten to Santa Barbara, my pastoral region, and there was an ecumenical gathering, and we had people of all the different religions, and then some kind of more like a hippie type people, we're talking about the new agey thing, and they were just really singing the praises of the earth, and I said, well, I'll do that too. I said in the cadences of the book of Genesis, but the world is good, but it's not God. When we get that wrong, a lot of trouble ensues. And so Genesis keeps saying, we're de-divinizing these various elements. Don't worship them. However, it is not denigrating them. Rather, it's putting them in their proper place. Now, what do I mean? Many scholars point out that as the elements come forth in this stately manner, one day following the other, what we're witnessing is a kind of liturgical procession. Think of the elements of a liturgical procession coming forth in a stately way, one after the other. Who comes at the end of a liturgical procession? I was at the end of one today as a bishop, so the priest or bishop, the one who presides at the prayer, comes at the end. What's the role of creation? The role of creation is to give praise to God under the leadership of the high priest. Now, here's the role of the human race. Here's all of us, as we know, by baptism, called to be priests, to lead, as it were, all of creation in right praise. Now, watch this theme subtly expressed throughout the opening chapters of Genesis. The early commentators saw Adam before the fall as the first priest, and the Garden of Eden as a kind of primal temple. Adam, before the fall, is in the stance of adoratio. Now, go back here to Pope Benedict. It was at World Youth Day 2005 that he gave the young people this beautiful etymology, right? Adora in Latin. Adoratio means to the mouth of, to be mouth to mouth. That means aligned. Do you remember in the beginning of the Song of Songs, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth? Well, it's this beautiful love poem, but it's always been read as the relation of the soul to God. Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth means, may I be in the stance of adoratio. Lined up, aligned. All of my powers aligned to God and to God's purposes. And see, when that happens, then my interiority becomes properly ordered. And then around the proper ordering of the human comes the proper ordering of the culture, of the city, of the society, of nature. There's Adam before the fall, the primal priest in the primal temple, leading all of creation in the right praise of God. Don't deify creation, but see it in its properly liturgical role. Adam is priest, he's also what? King. He's also king. What's his task? To cultivate that garden and to defend it. And then, having cultivated it properly, to extend its influence. So again, the early commentators saw Adam meant to go on the march, to Edenize the world, to turn the whole world into a place of right praise. Do you see how the priestly and the kingly elements come together in Adam? So what's wrong with Adam? Well, now we look at the original sin. You might say it's a compromising of his priesthood and his kingship. When Adam begins to worship something other than God, namely his own ego, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what happens is he falls apart interiorly. The disintegration of the self follows from bad praise. Does that make sense? That's why, that wonderful word orthodoxy, which in the derivative sense means right belief, but the fundamental sense of that term is right praise, doxa in Greek, right praise. Orthodoxy, the right praise of all of creation, that's the solution. What's the problem? Bad praise. So one way to look at original sin is Adam falling out of this relationship, and then around him, the city, the society, the culture, nature itself falling apart too. The disintegration. Secondly, a way to read original sin, Adam is a bad king. Why? Well, he allows the serpent to influence him. He allows the serpent to have sway in the garden. He doesn't properly defend the garden, and therefore he's not able to extend the influence of the garden more widely. He's a dysfunctional king. Now, what's God's purpose throughout the Bible? You might say to restore and eventually to enhance in a way that we didn't imagine possible this great identity of priesthood and kingship. Therefore, Israel begins to look, to search, to seek for the true priest and the true king. Now, we know who that is, don't we? We are on the far side of the incarnation, know that it reaches a climax in Jesus. The true high priest, now read the letter to the Hebrews, the true King of Kings. What's he called? He's called the new Adam by Paul, which has tons of resonance, but see the point I'm making. He's the new Adam, the new priest, the new king. He's also called the Son of David, isn't he? Born in David's city. Well, who's the, if you want, pivotal or transitional figure between Adam and Christ? David. David. When Israel finds, not its absolute fulfillment, but finds a beautiful expression of the kingly priest or the priestly king. Okay? That's the main point I want to make, and I just want to now look at it from a couple different angles in my 21 minutes. Excuse my voice, too. I've got a bit of a cold I'm recovering from. Let's go back to the very beginning of the Samuel literature, the beginning of 1 Samuel. And this wonderful story of Hannah. Now, who is Hannah? You could say she's someone at the lowest end of the social spectrum. She's the lowest rung of the social ladder. A childless woman, now this is unfair, but in biblical times would have been seen as someone of very low status. And yet she is one of the most significant figures in salvation history, because it's through Hannah, and we'll see now her great gift, that the story of salvation goes on. Now, I want to read you something, and Tim, I'm sorry if Tim Bush is here. I stole this from my room. I'll bring it back, I promise. I didn't bring my Bible with me. You know, right before 1 Samuel is the book of Ruth, and that's a wonderful book, of course, and there's all kinds of reasons it's there. But in the Deuteronomistic history, if we follow that reading, the one chronologically that precedes 1 Samuel is the book of Judges. And now listen to how Judges ends. It's really relevant to us, I think, this little line. Listen now. Very last verse of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, America 2016, we go like, yeah, perfect. That's what we want, autonomy. There's no king telling me what to do. But see, in a biblical reading, this is not good news at all. This is the worst possible news. Israel is looking for a king, because a king who will properly gather the tribes in right praise and right order will make Israel live up to its mission of being the focal point now for all the nations of the world. See, Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, all the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. That means the tribes of Israel, but then through their dynamism, all the tribes of the world. Without a king, every man doing what was right in his own eyes, what is that but an invitation to scattering? Now we're back at the Tower of Babel, the scattering of Israel, and therefore the scattering of the world. See, this is not the place to be. Now, we we reverence autonomy, but that's not a great biblical value. The great biblical value, if you want, is theonomy, right? Where God becomes the nomos, the law of your life, not autonomy. I am my own law. That's a recipe for disaster in the Bible. So, what does God do? Well, see, God never tires of sending rescue operations. That's the story, it seems to me, of the Bible. We're always getting off the beam. We have from the beginning. You know that lovely story from the rabbis? I love this. Someone asked one of the rabbis, how much time was there between the creation and the fall? And the answer was, well, about 15 minutes, which strikes me as about right, you know. We tend to get off the beam. That's the point, you know. Okay, so God is now going to try to launch a rescue operation, and he does so in typical fashion through someone at the lowest end of the ladder. So we're told of this man called Elkanah and his 2 wives, right? Peninnah and Hannah. So Hannah's one of his 2 wives. The former has given him children, but the latter has not. And so up they go on a regular basis to Shiloh, which was the holy city before the temples established in Jerusalem. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And Hannah there, as we know, prays and she sheds tears, praying for a child. I love this now from Mr. Sensitivity. Listen to Elkanah, the husband. He says, "Why do you grieve? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Well, the answer implied, of course, is evidently not, evidently not, honey. The point, of course, here is that God works, and typical of the Bible, typical of the great tradition of the church, too. God works through the most lowly and despised. One of the great principles from the spiritual masters is where you stumble, that's where you dig for treasure, right? And those of us who, we're addicted to success. That's one of the things we get addicted to easily. Success, power, privilege, look at me. But the Bible's never that interested in all that business. That's worldly talk. The Bible holds up a complete failure, namely the crucified Jesus. Look at him, a complete failure in the eyes of the world. Where you stumble, where you trip and fall, that's where you dig for treasure. So the treasure is going to come now from Hannah. Listen to her prayer now. "If you look with pity on the misery of your handmaid, if you give your handmaid a male child, I will give him to the Lord for as long as he lives." And then another figure comes in, displaying the same level of pastoral sensitivity as Elkanah, namely Eli, the priest. Listen. "How long will you make a drunken show of yourself? Sober up from your wine," he says to poor Hannah, who's been praying. And Hannah, with, I think, extraordinary dignity, beautiful dignity and self-possession, says, "I've had neither wine nor liquor. I was only pouring out my troubles before the Lord." Again, this despised figure. And that's the point here, is he's being made fun of. Imagine having your clock cleaned by the high priest like that, and publicly humiliated, and yet maintaining her dignity. She explains what she's doing. It's from her that the salvation will come. She gives birth, the Lord hears her prayer. She gives birth to Samuel, who was begged of the Lord. And then Hannah performs this act, which I think is absolutely paradigmatic now in the Bible. It corresponds precisely to what John Paul called the law of the gift, right? Which I would sum up as, your being increases in the measure that you give it away. Now, if you take nothing else from my talk, please take that from John Paul II. Your being increases in the measure that you give it away. Now, that's not just nice poetry. There's a metaphysics behind that. See, because God is love, right? That's what God is, straight through. And therefore, when you receive the divine life, you can't hang on to it. Because if you hang on to it as a possession, it stops being the divine life. Does that make sense? God exists in gift form. He is love. And therefore, if you try like the prodigal son, "Father, give me my share coming to me." It's lovely in the Greek there. He asks for the ousia coming to me. It's the Greek word for substance, but it meant, in the koine of the time, it meant like my money. Give me the money coming to me so I can hang on to it. Well, what happens to the prodigal son is he fritters it away. Of course he does, because the divine life can't be held onto in that form. It's only had on the fly, right? Namely, as you receive it, give it as a gift. And then you'll get more. When you get more, give that as a gift, and you get more. Until it becomes the water bubbling up in you to eternal life, as Jesus told the woman at the well, right? The same issue is you come to the well every day and you grab and you drink and you take, and you're thirsty again. Well, of course you are, because you can't have the divine life in that form. What you receive, give. What you receive, give, and you get more of it. So here's Hannah at this pivotal moment in salvation history. And she receives a gift from the Lord, her son Samuel. And what does she do? But she gives him back. And out of that generous gift flows, you might say, the rest of salvation history. It's from that gift that the thing is able to move forward. What blocks the purposes of God, fellow sinners, is when we make that little move of clenching and grasping. I'm going to take it and make it my own. No, it's the people who enter into the loop and the rhythm of grace that allow the divine purposes to continue. So that's a little bit about Hannah. And I want to say now a word about Eli. We just seen his magnificent pastoral presence, Eli and his sons. So he's the high priest there at Shiloh. We've seen he's not a shining example of pastoral sensitivity. He needs CPE or something, we'd say in the seminary world. But on the other hand, he took Samuel in and he raises him. He's kind of a mentor to young Samuel. We hear about his two sons, right? Hophni and Phinehas. And they are bad right through. So Eli's kind of an ambiguous figure, I'd say. Hophni and Phinehas are bad right through. What are they doing? Well, they're taking advantage of people by abusing their own priesthood, really. Listen, they were having relations with the women serving at the entry of the meeting tent, and they take the best of the meat offerings for the sacrifices. So they're taking advantage of their power and position as priests to abuse the people. Now, complaints we hear are brought before Eli. He heard repeatedly how his sons were mistreating all Israel. So the people bring the complaint to the high priest. To his credit, initially, Eli speaks to his two sons. Why are you doing such things? It's not a good report I hear that the people are spreading about you. So he does. He warns them. He speaks to them. But then Hophni and Phinehas disregard their father's warnings and go on doing exactly what they were doing. At which point, God sends a messenger with this message. Listen, yes, the time is coming when I will break your strength and the strength of your family so that no man in your family shall reach old age. There's a warning from God because he's not acting to deal with the bad behavior of his sons. Here's a motif, everybody, I think is right through the David literature, the Samuel literature, is the theme of the ineffective king. Now go back, remember Adam, it's bad king. Adam didn't care for the garden, didn't tend the garden adequately, didn't protect it from the evil influence. We all know in Shakespeare, we all know about Macbeth, we all know about Richard III, people that are grasping for power. But there are people in Shakespeare. Think of King Lear, who abandons his power at the beginning of the play. Or think of Titus Andronicus, who's offered the crown of Rome, and no, he refuses it. And from that great refusal flows all the tragedy of those two plays. It's a king that doesn't do his job, a king that's not adequately protecting what's given to him to protect, that causes an awful lot of trouble. Watch that all the way through the Samuel literature, and you see it strongly here. Now, eventually we hear that Samuel comes of age, and we have that delicious story. We all love it, and it's a beautiful story of the Lord calling to young Samuel, remember? And because it says, vision was infrequent. How come, by the way? Vision was infrequent. God's fault? God decided to stop appearing, to stop speaking? No, I think it's witness to a culture that's grown blind and deaf. A culture that has forgotten how to see and how to hear. Sound familiar at all? We who live in this now hyper-secularized society, one way to describe a secularized society is one that's forgotten how to see and how to hear in regard to the things of God. Well, this is Israel now having drifted far from the ways of God. Eventually, the Lord gets through to young Samuel. Eli says, go and say, here's your servant, I'm listening, and so on. And it's beautiful. It's a story about spiritual direction, about the way God speaks, about how we hear. All that's true. But I think what's interesting is we always end the story there, don't we? When we read it in the lectionary, that's where the story ends, with Samuel beautifully going in to listen to the Lord. But we don't listen to what the Lord says. Here's what he says. So imagine this kid, the Lord's speaking. Go, listen. Here's what he says. I am about to do something in Israel that will cause the ears of everyone who hears it to ring. On that day, I will carry out in full against Eli everything I threatened against his family. Though he knew his sons were blaspheming God, he did not reprove them. That's what God says to little Samuel. This is not a gentle message, of all is well. And no. In other words, what he's saying is, I'm going to do what I warned him about. Unless he takes action, that's what God's going to do. What happens next? Israel gets into battle with the Philistines, and it's a dreadful battle, a terrible loss. And so Israel says, let's get the Ark of the Covenant. We'll bring the Ark of the Covenant itself into battle. That'll win the day. It's even a greater disaster. 30,000 we hear are killed, and the Ark is taken away. And Hophni and Phinehas are killed. The news is brought back to Eli. He's waiting by the gate of the city. When he receives it, in his shock, he falls over backward and dies. Now, here's my question. Here's my question to you. Does any of that story sound familiar to you? We got bad priests abusing their people, taking advantage of their people because of their office. We hear of a word of complaint brought to their superiors, to the high priest, who speaks some words but doesn't really act. Further warnings from God, followed by inactivity, resulting finally in a disaster for Israel. That's the story of the last 25 years, seems to me. See, God never abandons his church, but we need to read our church, by the way, called the New Israel. We need to read our church through a biblical lens. What's been going on the past 25, 30 years? Yes, a disaster. But God doesn't abandon us, but rather God is moving us through, it seems to me, this process of cleansing and reform and renewal. Painful, yes. Yes, this was a disaster for Israel. We've been through the worst period in American Catholic Church history. No question about it in my mind. If you'd asked me 30 years ago what was the worst period, I would have said 19th century when they were burning down convents and all that. Last 30 years, far worse than that, it seems to me. But see, God does not abandon the New Israel, his church. But rather God is following this pattern of cleansing and renewal. I think we see it here. I got 5 minutes to talk about David and Goliath and all kinds of fun things here. I'll do maybe two more quick things with you. Let's say a word about David and Goliath. I remember years ago when I was a young priest, I gave a talk in the parish about David and Goliath. And the pastor got up and he was making the announcements and he goes, Father Barron's going to be speaking on David and Goliath. You got to come out and see how that thing turns out. I mean, who knows how that's going to go. I'm skipping a couple things here just with time in mind. I'm trying to cut to the chase if I can. What's one of the first things we hear about David? That the Spirit of God rushed on David. The Spirit of God rushed upon David. I said it at Mass this morning, gratia prima, right? Grace first. Grace first. And I mentioned it, if Luther had said gratia prima, not gratia sola, we'd be okay. The trouble with gratia sola. But gratia prima, right, grace comes first. David's chosen. The Spirit of God rushes upon David. Notice, please, when David acknowledges that and turns to the Lord consistently, things go well. When David turns away from that, when David relies upon his own strength, that's when things go bad. Basic spiritual principle. Grace comes first. It rushes upon him. We've all been chosen, every one of us, as king, as priest, we've all been chosen. Baptism. Turn to the Lord. That's where your strength comes. When you rely on your own, things go bad. Next, we hear that David is a singer. So he comes to soothe Saul, right, who's been received a bad spirit from Yahweh, we hear. David's a warrior, and David is a singer. I think it's very important, everybody, just from a historical standpoint. to see that the great leaders, they are warriors to be sure, but they're also poets, aren't they? Think of Lincoln, famously in our country. How many remember Lincoln's particular policies about, the fiscal arrangements and this and that? But who forgets Lincoln's words, right? Where Lincoln became the sweet singer of America, as David was the sweet singer of Israel. Many point out, that Churchill fought with the one weapon he had in 1940, which was the English language. All I have to give you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We'll fight on the beaches. We'll fight in the streets. We'll fight. Well, he was marshaling the power of the language to defend the country. I often tell seminarians, and because everyone in this room is a leader in the church in some way, that we lead through our persuasive and poetic speech to articulate the vision, to articulate what God is about. It's a huge part of our leadership. And David demonstrates that no more wonderfully than when he stands against Goliath. You come at me with sword and scimitar. I come after you with the power of the Lord God. What's he doing there? Not just threatening this giant adversary, but he's summing up the very identity of Israel. That's where Israel finds its power. That's where the new Israel still finds its power. I love this about Goliath as he's described. I don't even know what a lot of these words mean, but they sound cool. He's wearing bronze greaves and a bronze scimitar slung from a baldric. I don't even know what a baldric is, but it sounds mean, doesn't it? The shaft of his javelin was like a weaver's heddle bar. Any weavers? What's a heddle bar? I imagine it's that thing. Its iron head weighed 600 pounds. Well, here's the point. The scholars say that Goliath is wearing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 pounds of armor. So I always think of, I'm out here in California, I think of Schwarzenegger in one of his movies from the 80s, in full Terminator mode with the sunglasses and that's what we're meant to see here. We're meant to see in Goliath the full array of worldly power and self-protection. You remember, this is Origen's reading of the book of Exodus when the Egyptians have enslaved the Israelites. And they make the Israelites do two things: to build monuments for the Pharaoh and to build fortified cities. Now, Origen's point is that's what we all do all the time, we sinners. We take the best of us, the best of our creativity, intelligence, and courage and so on, and we dedicate it to monuments to ourselves, look at me, and fortified cities, protecting ourselves, right? That's much of the drama of human life is, hey, have they noticed me? And am I protected from possible attacks? Well, there's Goliath now, Schwarzenegger, covered in 1,000 pounds of armor, is the way a lot of us move through life. Now, this is where the spiritual masters come in, and fellow sinners, you know what I'm talking about. Do you feel that way sometimes, that you're kind of moving through life because you're so concerned about protecting your ego all the time? How does David come after him? He tries to put on Saul's armor. What a lovely detail that he can't move in it, He's not used to it, and he can't move in it. So David goes out unprotected, but mobile, see? Light on his feet. There's a spiritual symbolism there. So much of us go through life weighed down with all the preoccupations of self-protection. But to go out, to face life with that kind of blithe spirit of trust in the Lord, that's a better way to move and to live. And then, of course, we see it's anticipated here, it's fulfilled on the cross of Jesus. What we see is we're not going to conquer Goliath so much by taking him on his own terms. All right, you got 1,000 pounds of armor, I'm going to put 2,000 pounds of armor on. You got that gun, I'm going to get a bigger gun. That tends not to work. But rather, it's a different strategy employed by David. Many years ago, I got 1 minute left. Many years ago at Mundelein, I had a student who was a martial arts specialist. And he told me about this martial art called Aikido. Do you know about that, anybody? Aikido is a martial art. It's an art of war, but it's not like a direct confrontation. Watch Jackie Chan's movies. He does Aikido, which is it's to use the momentum and strength of your opponent against him, right? So that you deftly get out of the way at the last minute. Or you use your own body as leverage and you bring him to the ground. It's you use the very power of your opponent against him. And I remember the student told me the purpose of Aikido is it's not to kill your opponent, not to injure your opponent, is to leave your opponent laughing on the ground. Like, I can't possibly defeat you. Now, I say it's not perfectly exemplified here. It's perfectly exemplified on the cross of Jesus, it seems to me. But David going out practically undefended, relying on the power of God and on his own kind of lithe and deft maneuvering to outmaneuver the great Goliath. It's a hint. I just finished, I promise it's not a commercial, I just finished this film series, The Pivotal Players. And one of our pivotal players is Michelangelo. And we got in to see, of course, the great David sculpture. And everyone rightly sings the praises of that statue as this beautiful example of Renaissance humanism, the glorification of the beauty of the body, et cetera, et cetera. All that's true. But what I emphasized was David as this pivotal biblical figure who looks back to Adam, who was naked, unselfconsciously so, before the fall, and afterwards has to cover and defend himself. And looking forward to Christ naked on the cross, who goes out against the Goliath of the world, all the powers of the world, but not with the weapons of the world, but going out naked and utterly reliant upon the power of God. And in that great act of Aikido, outmaneuvers the powers of the world. I said, can you see in the nakedness of David, as Michelangelo portrays it, both the nakedness of Adam before the fall and the nakedness of Christ on the cross? And then keep in mind, the same Michelangelo does that magnificent statue of the nude, resurrected Christ, the new Adam, right? I think everybody, it's anticipated here in David's great battle with Goliath. I got 0.0 time. Can I do, Father Spitzer, one more quick little, I'll do one, because I know everyone's tired. You heard a lot of talks this morning. Let me do, let me just do this last little image for you. So David eventually, after the civil war with Saul, emerges as the power in Israel. He unites the tribes, right? He brings the 12 tribes together. How important that was when just after David, the tribes split up again, north and south. How significant, by the way, that Jesus, the new David, gathers the tribes, the 12 apostles, symbolic of the 12 tribes. Jesus reaching out at every opportunity to bring in the exiled tribes, etc. So David brings them together. He's operating here as a good king. He's operating here as Adam in his kingly mode. But then the king is also the priest. And so David gets the Ark of the Covenant. And in this great liturgical procession, brings it into his capital city. And beautifully, memorably, David dances before the Ark, right? Now, how do we read that? Think of Adam before the fall, moving in easy familiarity with Yahweh. Adoratio, mouth to mouth. Imitating, if you want to put it this way, the movements of God. Adam dancing harmoniously with God. What sin but a falling out of this harmonious dance? Dancing on my own terms, according to my own ideas. This harmony turning into a kind of cacophony. How do we read the dance of David before the ark, but humanity now being restored to this right rhythm in relationship to God? He's dancing before the law. It's weird, isn't it? Can you imagine we be dancing before the traffic laws or before tax specifications or even before the Constitution? Well, no, I mean, we see the law as kind of a necessary evil. But the law that enables you to do what you want to do, the law that awakens in you your own deepest desires. That's a law that you want to dance before, as David now dances before Yahweh. They say, I love this, and my Bible friends here know more about it than I do. Scott and Tim and others can help me with this, but they say that some of the movements of the priests in the Jerusalem temple, built by David's son Solomon, were meant to imitate the Davidic dance. So some of the gestures and movements were imitating this primal dance of David. And then everybody, if those moves of the temple priests had some influence upon the developing Christian liturgy, is there something to our gestures and bowing and movement and procession that's meant to evoke David's dance, which in turn calls to mind the great dance of Adam before the fall? This is the king and the priest coming together as one. I think I'll end it there, because I go into much more, but I think I'll bring it to a close there. Could I encourage everybody, dig out your Bibles. Don't steal it from the room as I did. But dig out your Bible and read through 1 and 2 Samuel, this truly pivotal text, right in the heart of biblical revelation. And I think you'll find enormous spiritual uplift. God bless you all. Thanks for listening today. Thanks.
You're welcome. God bless you. Bishop Barron, thank you so very, very, very much for that wonderful talk. I just have to say, it really does remind us that this biblical narrative is so applicable to contemporary culture again and again and again and again. That the same four little elements that Bishop Barron went through are present in our lives. That God gives us this instruction, shows us the way to the light. We wind up trying to abide by it, and then one day we just let ego get in the way, whether collectively as a nation, collectively as a church, or individually. Ego just gets in the way, and then one day we start this philosophy, a new philosophy, a dark philosophy. I want more than enough. And of course, once that happens, God has to let the forces of darkness that we've entered into take its shape. But then he sends his repair mission, as Bishop Barron put it. And in that repair mission brings us back to the light through some new surprise. The surprise of grace, the surprise of the Holy Spirit, the surprise of taking over history and divine providence. It's a beautiful scenario. Absolutely applicable. It means we should never give up hope ever, because God will keep doing an infinite number of repair missions. But we got to really keep ourselves in check, because that ego, unchecked, is going to be a dark disaster area. Thank you for enlightening us once again, Bishop Barron, in this incredible talk.